Good morning, everyone. Let's get ready to start our Sunday school. If we can take our seats. We do have Sunday school for different age groups. You can get with one of the ushers, and they'll be glad to show you. Let's sing, He Set Me Free.
He set me free, yes, He set me free. He broke the bonds of prison for me. I'm glory bound by Jesus, 'cause He's singing glory to God.
Let's all rise this morning. He set me free, yes, He set me free. He broke the bonds of prison for me. I'm glory bound, my Jesus, to see. He that believeth,
To God He set me free.
he that believeth, has everlasting
life.
And he that believeth on the Father and the Son has everlasting. When I get to heaven, gonna walk all around, have everlasting life. Gonna sit down by my Jesus, gonna put on my crown, have everlasting life. Amen, amen. Let's establish an atmosphere of worship as we sing on bended knee.
On bended knee I come with a humble heart. I come bowing down before your holy
Lifting holy hands.
Lifting holy hands to you as I pledge my life anew. I worship you in spirit. I worship you in truth. Make my life holy praise.
Let's give God praise this morning. Father, we thank you, my God. Lord, we love you. We exalt you. We glorify you, my God. Lord, we need you this morning, my God. Your spirit and your presence in Jesus. Dart, do you mind opening us up in prayer?
Amen. It's good to see you this morning in our Sunday school. Glad you joined with us online. And here we are continuing to look at next level, going to the next level. And we started last week on next level of fruitfulness. We looked at John 15. We began to look at that verse and see the picture, the image that Jesus left for us, which was which had to deal with the issue of the vine and the branches. And in the end, Jesus says, one of the marks, one of the things I'm going to look for, what I will actually begin to examine and try to discover if there is in your life fruit. And on one level, we saw that fruit as character, the issue of what the Bible would call the fruit of the Spirit. Living the Christian life, the actual outflow of Jesus' life moving through us and becoming godly people, and why in that verse in John 15, the very stark and real warning of, if there is no fruit, the branch will be cut off. And the truth is that verse for a lot of people isn't in the Bible, not because it isn't written, but because they don't want to read it. I mean, they just don't want to look at it. It's such a truth that shocks the system, especially for someone who's heard that God is like a parent who spoils their child, doesn't care what they do, doesn't care how they live. All he wants to do is love and help them. Yes, he does want to love and help, but he does look for fruit. That's what clearly Jesus tells us. He begins to look and see if the branches are bearing the right fruit. Now, as we talk about fruit, the other aspect of fruit, especially in the Bible, is one of bearing children. And we can look at that in a spiritual way for us as a church, which is commonly seen, or I should say is one of the ways that people do look at fruitfulness, which is whether or not you're able to reach people. Whether or not there are ministries that are created that are able to reach people. I have had the wonderful privilege of seeing people get saved, and as they get saved, they then become fruitful. Like I said before, there's some mystery to this. I am not going to act like I understand every single thing on how this works. There is a parable we're going to look at, though, that I do believe there are some very clear principles that Jesus gives us on how it does work to an extent. But then there's some mystery. I've seen people who are fruitful, and it blows my mind because, they try their best. They're not perfect Christians, but there's something that's magnetic about them to people. And they draw people in. They have ministry ideas. They do something, whether it's in drama or a band, and you can sense it. When you put them on the streets, people they're drawn to it. That kind of dimension is what I believe the normal Christian life should be like. Jesus doesn't say fruitfulness is this special object. It's this unattainable reward. It's this kind of trophy that some people can get and other people can't. Jesus told us in John 15, every Christian should be fruitful. Every Christian should be fruitful. That means somewhere in your life, there is a desire at some point for you the moment you got saved was to reach someone. To be able to witness and to evangelize. This isn't just something we put on. This is not a program that we've simply created. All we do as a fellowship is we facilitate what God has already planted within people. That is a desire and a design to fruitfulness. This is not something, we're working with nature here. We're working with God's kingdom. This is a dynamic that we didn't create. We simply saw, we facilitate for it. I've shared the story last week where people get saved and there's a desire in them to be used by God. There's simply a desire. They don't understand it. They don't have everything figured out. But there's something in them that says, I want to reach someone else. I want to help someone else. And one of the things we did bring up last week was the issue of pruning. And I do want to touch on that a little bit this morning. And when we start talking about pruning and fruitfulness, there's a very interesting, or I should say, a very curious dynamic. And that is that someone can be very fruitful, and then they go through a season where they're not. And this is, for some people, a big shock. And I had shared that when I went overseas after the first time I had pioneered, which was a church that grew dynamically in a very unusual way within the first 5 years of us being there. I remember people would visit and they were shocked because we didn't have seats, meaning we packed the buildings out where we were at. We would have events. It was standing room in the back. It was a powerful environment. And then I go overseas, and it's nothing like that. It's the exact opposite. I worked harder overseas with less results than I had in the first church I had. And I thank God for that experience because it taught me something very important. God is the giver of fruit. We are not the creators of it. We are simply the branch. We're just the channel. The moment the branch thinks it's the root, it's got a problem. We do not arbitrate anything. This is why, you run across that attitude every once in a while. People in church, I remember hearing a horrific story of a young man getting saved in a congregation, bringing all these people in, getting mad at the pastor and telling the pastor, I'm going to leave. And you watch, when I leave, this church is going to shut down. The church never shut down because he was just a branch. Fruitfulness comes from God. And pruning is an element, or pruning is a part of our walk with God, which seasons of times of barrenness or seasons of time where God is dealing with us and working things out in us. Put up that quote for me if you have it. Why do we prune? This is actually taken from a vineyard dresser, someone who's in California who actually does this for a living. And this was in a gardening article. And I had sent it by email. It's under the pruning. Why do we prune? Because if the vine is not pruned, it reverts very quickly to wild nature, climbing everywhere with its long, sinewy trunk and tiny, scraggly branches of uneven grapes. Every year we need to assess the growth of the vines and decide whether to prune them back harder or let them grow a bit bigger or return them to the same size and shape they were the year before. If we prune correctly, the vine will be balanced. That means it will grow just enough. If it grows too much, the resulting vines will be thin and simple, and if it grows too little, the vine will be better and hard. The right amount of growth, what we call balanced growth. That's the reason why we get pruned. Because God, in the end, is looking at our lives for fruit, and he wants the fruit to be balanced. That means there's a encouraging principle here, and that is that when you go through a trial, when you go through a season of times of pruning, of barrenness, where you feel like things aren't just happening for you, God's not angry. He's not just trying to frustrate you. He's trying to make sure that your life is going to be balanced. There's a point that we come to when we feel those things that either we're going to go to God, we're going to stay to ourselves. And I believe it's in those moments that helps balance everything out for us. And the fruit then becomes so much more better. God has an ultimate end for us, and that is that we would become productive, valuable, fruitful people in his kingdom. And that's why there are seasons of pruning. Now, having said that, because that's what we were looking at last week a little bit, and we're closing off on that, I want to now look at the verses that we're going to kind of watch over this morning and begin to study through. And let's look at, if someone can get for me as we get ready to read, this is going to be last week's text, John chapter 15, verses 1 through verse 4 only. John chapter 15, verses 1 through verse 4. Who can get that for me? Lift up your hand very quickly. Tracy, Bill, if you can actually get for me Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through 9. Luke 13, 6 through 9. That's going to be the next parable that we're going to look at, that's going to help us see the hope of fruitfulness this morning. That's really what I want to leave you with when we start talking about the next level. There's a hope for fruitfulness. Every Christian can be fruitful. Every Christian, God has a desire for you to be fruitful. This isn't something you have to twist his arm to get. He wants you to be that way. And who can get for me also Psalm chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Psalm 1, 1 through 3. If you can lift up your hand very quickly. Jonathan over here, Psalm 1, 1 through 3. Who can get for me 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Who's that in the back? Chris? All right, you had your mask on. Chris, you can get me 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Who can get for me John chapter 12, verse 24. John 12, 24. Rick, thank you very much. So let's look at John chapter 15, verses 1 through verse 4. Go ahead and read that.
I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me.
Right here, Jesus tells us fruitfulness comes from him, and it's our connection to him, and it's a design here. He's giving us an image of the Christian life as a vine. He's trying to tell us, when you come to me, you aren't just someone that sits in a pew. I know in our minds, we would think of the Christian walk, especially because church is the main kind of concept people have, or I should say what they do in church, which is just sit. That the idea is almost like people think they get saved, they're getting saved and they're joining a sports club so they can watch a sports team in the arena. They can sit back and just watch and cheer at the right times, sing at the right times, and then that's how you know you're a Christian. Well, Jesus says it differently. Jesus says the real way that we know you're a Christian is not just what you do here, but what you do out there. And whether or not there's life that begins to overflow, because that's all fruit is. Fruit is a life that is a byproduct of life that is channeling through you from the root. And if this life is able to move through you, it's not stifled because of the weeds, and it's not stifled because of tares, it's not stifled because of some kind of sickness or disease. It's not stifled from any of that. It begins to come out, and it's fruit. And Jesus gives us the picture that the real Christian life is monitored, measured, looked at on the issue of fruit. This is not something that is a side note. This is something that's important. And so Jesus tells us very clearly about the branch and fruitfulness. And so this morning, what we want to look at is the issue of the hope of fruitfulness, the hope for fruitfulness, that every Christian can be fruitful. And Jesus gives us a story. And the fact, the way the story ends, or the way the parable ends, is important. Because it doesn't tell us what happens, which I believe was done on purpose. It's an open-ended story. It's one of those without the actual ending, meaning there's no resolution. If a modern writer were to take this, they'd be frustrated with it because you're supposed to have resolution at the end of a plot line. Well, the truth is, this was more than a story Jesus is telling. It's a principle he's laying out for us. And I'm glad he didn't end it, because it's an open-ended question for all of us on how we want our lives to be like. Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through verse 9. Go ahead and you can read that.
He also spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of the vineyard, "Look, for 3 years I've come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground?" But he answered and said to him, "Sir, let it alone this year also, and I will dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well. But if it does not, after that you can cut it down."
After that, you can cut it down. So we have here a man going to a tree. And again, this is Jesus saying this parable is like the kingdom. There was a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard. And you know, in the New Testament, especially in Jesus' parables, the fig tree many times was representative of Israel. Take a step back, you can also apply this, not just interpreting it specifically as Israel, apply it to God's people in general. That this is a principle, this is an area, or this is an actual dynamic that God has that works around the Christian life, that the people of God are expected to have fruit. The man shows up and he's looking for fruit. It's not like he shows up and, well, maybe there's fruit, maybe there's not. He has an expectation that there is going to be fruit. And so barrenness isn't acceptable. That's the first principle I want to talk to you about here. Barrenness isn't acceptable. If it was, the man would not have shown up looking for fruit. He would not have shown up looking for fruit. But he had an expectation. Why did he have an expectation? Because the normal way it works is there needs to be fruit. Not maybe, not hopefully, but there needs to be fruit. And see, the anticipation of fruit was the normal course in which this owner took. So for every Christian and every God-fearing person, every person who's walking with God, there will be a moment that there's a time where God begins to look and inspect and says, is there fruit? Is there? It's a good question to ask this morning. Is there fruit in your life? Godly fruit? Character fruit? People fruit? Have you impacted someone with your life? Even just one. I do believe there is a promise of fruitfulness, which means more than one. But just one. Okay, how about this last year? This last month? This last week? Fruit is something God is expecting. Psalm chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. Listen to what is described as a righteous person. I know in our minds, because of the caricature of our culture, righteousness is seen as a person who's demure and who simply kind of stays away, and someone who's holy or righteous is someone who kind of steps back and is abstaining from everything that's wrong, and hiding is really the image that's given. But listen to what the Bible says a person who's godly and righteous is like. Psalm chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 3.
Blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law does he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by rivers of water, It brings forth fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he does will prosper.
Have you ever seen a garden? Have you ever seen, you go somewhere and even if it's not a garden, you can go somewhere in an area where there's a river. And if you go by there, it doesn't matter, how hot it is outside. All the growth that's by the river is green and it's growing and it's flourishing. You get further away from it and it starts to turn yellow, especially here in Texas. Yellow's a prominent color during August, where the yards start to die. Grass starts to wither. But everything by water is still growing. And it says, you know what a righteous person is like? It's like a person who's fruitful when everything else is dying. When everything else is barren. This is why the church world can have all of its gimmicks and whatever it wants. It can stay as barren as it wants. The Bible tells us fruitfulness. It's the heritage of a righteous person. He expected fruit from that tree because he designed the tree and everything around it that it would bear fruit. Fruitfulness is a bit of a struggle here, though, because in the end, this tree didn't bear fruit. And that becomes the problem. The problem wasn't that the expectation was wrong. The problem was that there was something wrong with the tree. There was something happening. You know what's interesting here? The Bible doesn't tell us what it is. And I believe that also is for a reason. It doesn't tell us that it had undergrowth. It doesn't tell us that the weeds were choking it like it does in the other parts of the Bible. That people could not bear fruit because the weeds that choked it out. Those are the parable of the sower. It says one of the seeds that fell began to grow, but the weeds began to choke it out so it doesn't bear fruit. I remember having a hibiscus plant. And this plant would never grow flowers on it. I thought I'm not a gardener in any way, shape, or form. Like I said before, I can't grow anything here in Texas. But you put me in the rainforest, I can grow all kinds of stuff. And so there we had several hibiscus plants. We're talking about 6, 7 feet. And they all were very, very pretty, different colors. But this one, it was a massive bush. I mean, massive. And it would give off 2 or 3 flowers. And I had someone help me look at it, and as he was looking at it, he showed me this weed, and there they just call it a spider weed. It's the weirdest thing. It really looks like a growth. And it's this weed that attaches itself, and it grows like a parasitic plant on this bush. But it's underneath everything, so it takes just enough life so the flowers can't grow, but the leaves can. And it sucks the life out of this thing. Absolute miracle happened. We cut it off. Within weeks, it began to grow flowers. And I remember thinking about that, and thinking about this whole principle here, and thinking about the vine, and thinking about the weeds and thinking, wow, this is what Jesus was talking about, that there are Christians, you want to be fruitful, but there are things that are choking out that fruit. And the actual owner, the vine dresser's coming, and he tries to cut those out, and we fight him. He said, no, I really like that. I don't want to let that go. It's not even about, he wants to make you say. It's about fruit, becoming more fruitful. He expected fruit because that's the way it was designed. God's expecting fruit in your life because that's the way you were designed. Let's talk a little bit here about fruit with people. One of the things that happens when you start working with other people is you realize it's a lot harder than it seems. Nobody has to say amen, it's true. It's a lot harder than it seems. Because in people's mind, okay, I'll give this person a ride, I'll help someone out, okay, I'm going to start doing this, I'm going to make a resolution this year, I'm going to start helping more people. And the moment you start helping more people, you start to discover people are very different than the way you are. People are very, you start thinking, wait a minute, why do you think that? Yeah, I'm giving you a ride to church. Well, yeah, and that's where you get the term, you give them an inch, they take a mile. I'm laughing because I can feel it. It's like, well, you know, you're not supposed to say this stuff right now. Well, I'm going to say it. For the reason of it's in that process that God's working out something in you, not just them. It's in that process that God is beginning to enlarge you, not just them. Sure, it's important that you do help people understand. Look, you're not owed anything. You're not owed anything. We do this because we're wanting to help you, but don't ever at one point, we're not the government. You're not entitled to anything. It's a privilege to talk to God. You know, that's a tough part, right? Because in people's minds, the entitlement mentality totally frustrates their ability to really relate to God. Because it's a privilege that God even bends his ear toward us. It's a privilege. It's not owed to us. You realize we did nothing to be born. We were simply brought here. He's the one who sustains us. It's a privilege. But then at the same time, it's good to be long-suffering, patient, and to learn that with people as well. That there will be people that will try your patience, that will test your faith, that will cause you to take a step back and think, wait a minute, there's something wrong with me or is it with them? I believe that's very healthy. I believe it's very healthy to start working with people that are very unlike you. If it was up to me, I'd work only with people who are from the area I'm from. It's not up to me, though. When we were asked to go to Southeast Asia, I had to look at it on a map to figure out where it was at. Never in my life would I have considered going to help people. I had no idea who they were. Never in my life, on my own, would I come up with an idea that says, yeah, okay, I was raised in an area where all I ate was Mexican food my whole life. Let me go to a place that has no Mexican food at all. I was raised in an area that just has one way of thinking. Let me go to another that it doesn't even comprehend how I think. Never in my life would I wanted to do that. But you know who does? God. That's why it is interesting to me that here in America, as we're in church, you meet people. You meet people at work. You meet people at the store. You meet people in different, and they're so different from you, but you take a step back and say, no, I can't talk to those kinds of people. That is a limiting factor in your life of fruitfulness. I believe God begins to try to stretch us out of those. He's expecting fruit, and he sets things into place, and the design is that you can and should be fruitful. This is a hope. This is not something that is simply looked at, arbitrarily say, okay, you're not bearing fruit, that's it, it's unjust. No, the reason he looked is because he designed it to bear fruit. The reason he looked is because he knew you have the capacity. The reason he looked is because he knows he has set things in motion, put people around you, set you in situations, put you in environments that he has already ordained to be fruitful, but you have to take advantage of it. You have to be tapped into that, the vine and the branch. You have to make that connection. You know, a lot of us went through COVID, right? And so for a lot of people, it's just a kind of story. How many know, though, there are people that are really afraid of this thing, like really, really afraid. They haven't even gotten it yet. They're terrified of it. I don't believe that's by coincidence. I believe God can use you in a way to share hope to people that right now so desperately need it. It doesn't have to come across as, hey, you're nothing, you're afraid. Why are you afraid of anything? Well, because people are dying. It's pretty straightforward. What they need is hope. And we're the ones to give it to them. Any questions, any comments here before we move on to the other point here? Back here, Les. Anyone else here? Questions, comments? Lift up your hand very high so I can see them. I can't see everyone. I try my best. Leah here. Les and Leah, and then we'll move on to the next verse. Go ahead, Les.
So I took this job at a welding place, and I had to get out of Habitat for Humanity, and so I took this job. I was already hired on the job and everything, and the lady that hired me tells me, do you realize I'm gay, right? I said, well, no, I didn't really know that. And she goes, yeah, and the office lady here with me, that's my wife. And I said, okay. So I took the job. You know, I was there, and I said, okay, this is going to be a very interesting environment, you know. But immediately I just began to pray on, you know, God, I see something here. You know, you put me here, and I believe I can be fruitful. I believe I can reach them with the gospel. Amen. And after prayer and just being a testimony, being a witness there, the manager, Sandra, she began to reach out to me, began to ask me about prayer, you know, about things about the Bible, God. She asked me for a prayer for Thanksgiving. I gave her Psalm 95 that she could read with her family. And then just recently, I was telling her about a Bible app. And so I actually downloaded a Bible app on her phone where she could listen to the scriptures. She tells me the next day, she goes, you know, I went to sleep listening to the Gospel of John all the way to the book of Acts. She goes, and I slept peacefully. Yeah. I said, yeah. I said, because that's what it is when you have a relationship with God. And she's telling me, yeah, but what about this gay thing? I said, well, you know what? You just need to get your heart right with God, and you know, God will work through all that. But it's been, you know, I've been in this environment before, and I was young and you know, full of fire and everything, and had a whole different concept. But now it's, you know, now I'm older and everything, and I want to say a little wiser, but it just seems like, you know, God put me here at this time so that he could touch this woman, and I definitely see that at work.
You know, you bring up something that I've been in prayer about, especially here in America. You come back, you things just seem to affect you differently when you move back. You come back, it's like your eyes are so clearly seeing things. It's frustrating. And one of the things is this whole agenda, this gay agenda that's moved into America. And I know it frustrates everyone. And as Christians, you look at it, but you start to notice that there's a tenor, there's a tone that starts to come out. And the tone is on one level correct, which is any sin you commit and you willfully begin to walk into it, you're going to be judged for it one day. Whether it's adultery, fornication, or homosexuality, you're going to be judged for it one day. It is what it is. Can't deny that, can't cover it up. But the other tone is of absolute unbelief that they cannot get saved. Absolute unbelief that God cannot convert them. It's almost the same tone I hear about Muslims and Hindus. People just don't believe that they can get saved. Those are so different. It's so, and I don't know if, I don't know when I shared this story. I don't know if I've shared it here. I shared stories with different people. And someone came and asked me about a Muslim, that they were overseas and this Muslim man got touched. And without going into all the story, he prayed with this man and his wife. And then this man asked him to visit him. He visited this man at his home, and the man then told him that he wanted him to pray with his other two wives. And this pastor was very much shocked at that point. He says, well, 3 wives? How many know that's against Scripture? Just like 2 women living together, 2 men living together. And he called me, and he asked me a question, and that was that, what would you do? Like, how do you work this through? I agree with Les. They get their hearts right, they'll work it out. The real problem is not to confronting him to get rid of his 2 wives. The real problem is getting him to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. That's the real problem. Because of the incarnation. I can't even go into all that. But Islam and the incarnation do not work. Meaning their concept of God and the fact that he becomes incarnate as flesh, in their minds, is one of the worst blasphemous things you could ever say. If you get him to believe that, getting rid of the 2 wives in their culture is really not that difficult. It's really not. But it's their heart. But see, what happens is we come across these people, they have these issues, these glaring, huge problems. And, we're not supposed to solve all their problems. We're supposed to bring them to Jesus. And it's a miracle what begins to happen after that. I agree wholeheartedly. And so all this agenda that's been pushed in America, all that's gone on, it is evil. I absolutely agree. But I will not take the stance of unbelief that says God cannot convert them by the droves. He can. He can. It'll take an absolute miracle, but he can do it. Very good. Leah, go ahead.
So I work at a school, and last year everybody was virtual, and we went through the mask mandates. And when they lifted the mandate, I was like, okay, I'm not going to wear a mask. Everyone makes their own choice. I'm not bashing anyone who does. But when it was not required, I didn't wear it, and I got called out for that by my principal. and pretty much like bullied. Like she's like, I'm gonna call a supervisor. I was shaking in my boots. I'm like, okay, and I said, and so she pulled me in, and it was interesting because she's very religious. And then, my other two coworkers are not, that are in the office. I work in the office. But when she fought it and I didn't fight, I didn't go on any stance. And she asked me then, like, I called my supervisor, this is what they said, because she can't make me, that was one thing. Freddie was like coaching me. You need to make sure that you handle this correctly. And, like if I had to report it or whatever. But anyway, but she didn't like say, she goes, well, I can't do anything about it. But let me ask you, Lo, why aren't you wearing it? And so, I could have just said, I don't need to tell you that. But I told her, I said, because we keep saying we want to get back to normal, and this isn't normal. Yeah. And she goes, aren't you afraid? Well, they know I had COVID and I was in the middle of cancer treatment. It put my cancer treatment off a month. And I looked at her and I said, no, I'm not. I said, I'm not afraid. I go, I just, and I know that's because I'm saved and I trust God. I already went through it. They knew I went through it. It was in the summer. So, but it was interesting though, because later my coworker, they had gone home. The admin had gone home for the day. It was in the summer where we just are alone. There's no teachers yet. And she was like, you're not afraid, Leah? She's like, why? And I said, Raina, it opened the door for me to just witness to her in a way that like I would never have the opportunity. And it was like all because of COVID, And then in recent weeks, I've been our nurse was out. So I was taking a lot of calls with families calling in, somebody's positive, and I do attendance and registration. So I had to tell them, okay, this is what will happen. And I started asking people, have you been through this before? And there's a couple families that were like, oh yeah, we did this, it's whatever. But then there's a couple that are like, no, and you can feel the fear. And I said, well, listen, I've been through COVID. My husband and I had it. It's a pain. We made it fine. And I bring up, I was in the middle of cancer treatment. I've come through both just fine. And I know it's because of God, and I don't go on and on because I can't go into full blown, but I always like, and I've had a family, she was like, oh, thank you so much for telling me that. She's like, because you can feel the fear. It's been almost 2 years. They hadn't had it yet. And oh my gosh. And now it's this. And I said, and we made it fine. I go, you'll be fine. Let us know if you need anything, whatever. And it's just been interesting, and then like my coworker recently was like, mentions out of the blue, texts me. She went through a loss. She's like, you're so strong in your faith. And she said something. And I'm like, choosing to serve God and then exercise my rights as, because that's not even what I threw in the face of my principal. Yeah. She's like, I know it's your right. Yeah. And I go, I didn't even go there. I was just like, no, it's normal. And we need to work towards that. And then Raina's watching all of this. And we talked to her. I witnessed to her. I said, Jesus is my hope, Raina. You think I wasn't afraid? You think I wasn't laying there worried, checking my pulse ox every couple hours? Yeah. Because I was. Yeah, it was new. And Brother Ray was in the hospital. And I was a little concerned. And I said, but you know what? God's my strength. I go, that's where my trust lies. It doesn't, and it's like over time, we've had more conversations. And it's, God used that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I'm so glad you mentioned that you didn't make your case, because how many know right now, especially with the tensions the way they are, Proverbs is correct. A soft answer turns away wrath. Where you're not, hey, you know what? That's not the right way to go right now. People are really afraid. I was struck by this the other day. I was at a store, and I was there with with Kathleen, one of my boys, Adara, and then Aviva, the baby. I was holding her, and I had a random person. I didn't ever know this person. I never talked to them. They were an older person. They came up to me, and he says, "You looks like you have a good family. I just want you to know, COVID is spiking again." This is a couple weeks ago. COVID is spiking again right now. You need to keep your kids inside. This man was terrified. I mean, terrified. What really struck me was he wasn't trying to tell me. I wasn't wearing a mask there at the time. I wasn't. None of our kids had masks. Kathleen didn't have a mask, and we're not. The truth is if you want to wear a mask, wear it. There's no way, shape, or form we're going to tell you, hey, you don't. It's not. You want to do it, do it. There's no problem with that whatsoever. Personally, I agree with the NCAA right now. Within 90 days, if you had COVID, you're considered fully immunized. That just changed last week. I don't know what's coming up in the NCAA soon, but something must be. So now you're fully immunized if you were within 90 days sick with COVID. So we're going to see things change and shift, and what you start to realize is there are people that don't have an anchor for their life at all. And every shift of sand, every wave thrown this way and that, they're tossed. And that's why when they start to look at you, they're like, man, you're so strong in your faith. What they're really saying is, there's an anchor you got that I don't. There's something that's holding you that I feel like, man, this is going this way and this is going that way. And we're not trying to be political at all when it comes to the masses. We're not trying to create any kind of tension with anyone. That's not our goal. That's not our desire. Just like with that man coming and talking to me. I didn't tell him, hey, get out of here, man. This is my right. You know, I'm a Texan for anything else, and I can do what I want. You know, I didn't do any of that. I really felt empathy for this guy. He was so afraid. So afraid. And I told him, I said, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. We trust God. God helps us. I will be careful. I did tell him, I'm going to be careful. We're not going to go out there. I promise you, I won't be licking door handles anywhere around here. And for the record, I do believe fear is healthy. There's a healthy form of fear. If you walk into a jungle and there are no lights anywhere and you don't feel fear, there's something very wrong with you. Right now, in this environment, there should be a sense of caution. There should be. That's healthy. There's nothing wrong with that. But we are not paralyzed. We have an anchor that transcends, that goes deeper than this situation right here. How deep? 2,000 years back. Through the plague, through all these other historical moments, we have an anchor that's deeper than all of that. That's Jesus. Let's look at the second issue here, and that is that God is patient. The wonderful thing about this story that I think personally is that he waited 3 years. 3 years. If you have that quote from the Avocado Planner, this is actually taken from the Avocado Commission in California. Be patient about seeing fruit. If you have purchased and planted a tree, this is an avocado tree, you can probably expect to see your first fruit 3 to 4 years after planting. Imagine planting a plant and waiting 3 to 4 years. Then it says this, if you are growing from a seed, it can take anywhere from 5 to 13 years before the tree is mature enough to set fruit. When the tree does flower, expect the louder flowers to fall without setting fruit. This is natural. Why did I read that? Because there was something that the owner knew. Sometimes some trees take a while to bear fruit, and I'm glad he was patient with this tree. He waited 3 full years. After reading that, I had an avocado seed, and I was going to plant it, but I didn't. 5 to 13 years. And so the reason I'm saying this is because 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20 is a wonderful text. This is about, in a different context of disobedience and living right, but it explains something about God's nature that I believe if it's applied to the sinner, it has to be applied to the saint. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Go ahead and read that.
Who formerly were disobedient, then once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through the water.
Why did it take so long before the flood? Well, it tells us because God was patiently waiting so that people would have an opportunity to repent. If he is long-suffering with them like that, he'll be that way with us, his people too. Why would he just cast us off? See, this is the hope that we have here. God's designed it for you to be fruitful. God has made it so that you have a desire for fruitfulness. And he also realizes that sometimes we run into situations and into places that we don't always have the ability, or there isn't that area, or we neglect it, or we walk away from it, or there are things that distract us from it. But the whole time he's still waiting, and he's watching, and he's still expecting. So maybe you haven't been very fruitful. Maybe you look back and you can't really point to real fruit. People's lives that have been changed through testimony, through a witness, ministries you've been involved in that have made it. Maybe that's not there. The good news is, it's not over. He looks and he waits. Let's look at our last one here. Investment has to be made. The truth is, he just doesn't look at this and say, okay, well, there's no fruit, just move on. The keeper of the vineyard says, look, I've come seeing fruit on this fig tree, I find none, cut it down. But then he answers, sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and fertilize it and it bears fruit well. But if not, after that you can cut it down. He says, wait a year, give me a whole year to dig it up, to till it, make the soil good, and to fertilize it. Give me this year to invest into it, which is the last principle I want to talk about here as we talk about fruitfulness. Investment must be made for fruitfulness. It has to be. Nobody becomes fruitful without fully investing themselves into it. It's just not possible. There has to be a point where you begin to look and say, I want to be fruitful. There's the famous story of Rachel. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. There has to be a desire in a person's heart that says, I want to be fruitful, or I don't want to go another step. There has to be a point of investment. There has to be a place where it says, this year, I'm going to make some decisions to begin to facilitate fruitfulness, to begin to prepare for fruitfulness. John chapter 12, verse 24 says it in so much stronger words about someone having to invest. John 12, 24. Go ahead and read that.
Most assuredly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain.
If it dies, it produces much grain. How do you say it another way? If it invests itself, it produces so much more. If it makes the investment, if it gives itself. I'm going to close right here. I remember reading the autobiography of Reinhardt Bonkin. There's a bunch of different stories in there, but the one that struck me, that I went back to look at it again, the one that really struck me was how he started his ministry. Reinhardt Bonkin has preached to thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at one time. If you've ever seen the videos or pictures of his crusades, it's really phenomenal. Just to see that mass of people is phenomenal. And to think that he started on a street corner in South Africa. And all he would do is he would take his guitar and he would go out there and sing songs, try to draw a crowd, and he'd preach just like what we do. It's fascinating to read that he'd just be by himself. And how did his team grow? How did his ministry team grow? It was the converts that he made on that corner. And so he's doing this week in, week out, week in, week out. He builds enough people together, so enough people are coming together with him, that he starts a church. He starts this church. He's praying about what God wants to do. He wants to see people saved. He has a big vision. So what he does is he gets this idea. I'm going to get this famous evangelist. He doesn't ever share this guy's name in his story. I've read it in several different places. He never shares the guy's name. He gets this famous evangelist who prays for the sick to come in and pray for the sick. And he passes out thousands and thousands of flyers. He has all these advertisement campaigns. What he really wants is to reach as many people as he can in the city of South Africa where he's at the time. And he does this big old thing. The guy shows up. He picks him up from the airport, takes him to his hotel. And later on that night, this famous evangelist calls him and says, I'm sorry, I have to go home. So Reinhardt Bonkin's thinking, go home? Our crusade starts tomorrow. Can't go home. So he tells him that, you can't go home. Our crusades. He says, I'm sorry, I have to go home. So he says, I'm actually in a taxi already. I'm leaving. I'm heading to the airport. I'm leaving. And Reinhardt is so thrown back. He's, I mean, you can't. The next morning is when their crusade starts. He's trying to figure out what he's going to do that night. He's thinking about this person, this other evangelist, this other person who's famous about praying for the sick. And all the things he's thinking about, he's looking, he's trying to figure out, how could I do this? I would have to fly this person and I can't fly them, and they don't have any opportunity. There's no time for them to come. And that whole night he's in crisis and he's praying, and God tells him, I want you to do the crusade. And Reinhardt Bonkin's like, but the flyer has another person's name and another. And so the next morning he's up. He's at the church. The place is packed. In the front row, there's all of these people in wheelchairs. There's all these people who have sick babies on the right side. And he's up there and he's thinking to himself, how can I just tell people we're not going to do it and we'll just kind of all go home? See, I can't. So he decides, as he takes the pulpit, they have the songs, everything, they go through it all, and takes the pulpit, and he announces that the evangelist left. But he was going to stay, that he was going to end up praying for the sick that morning. What was interesting about it was that he had tried praying for the sick before, and he wasn't successful. This is what struck me about the story. This is why he had the famous evangelist come. And in that moment, he made the greatest investment of his life. He decided that he was going to put himself out there, and if it all failed, it failed, but he was going to trust that if God, you can do it through that man, you can do it through me. And so what happened was a young boy who came up. He had a foot that was bent. He prayed for this young boy. The foot popped out. You could hear the visible sound of the pop. As they prayed for him, it went straight. He began to pray for the people in the wheelchairs. They got healed. You had miracle after miracle take place, and from that moment was what started his crusade ministry. Now, the reason why that story struck me was because here was a man who had all the capacity for fruitfulness. And in a moment when it was all going to fail, he had to decide, what am I going to do? I can't let this fail. You want to know what it's like to be invested into something? You do everything you have within your power. Say, this thing cannot fail. If I have to get out there and look like a fool, then so be it. If I have to get up behind a pulpit and sing, be the only singer in the church, then so be it. If I have to go and begin to pray for people out there, then so be it. No matter what. If I have to fast and pray for our band so that way they become more effective, then so be it. If I have to practice more, that would be helpful too. Then so be it. When I'm starting talking about investing yourself, I think about that story because in the end, the only reason why he did what he did was he looked and said, Lord, I am not going to allow this time to just go by. I'm not going to allow this opportunity to be wasted. No matter what I have to do, I'm going to do it. That's investing yourself into fruitfulness. You want to be fruitful? You got to take a heart that says, whatever happens with this, I am not going to walk away saying, well, I only did some of it. That's not my job. That's not really what I was getting into it for. You got to put your whole self out there. And Jesus said, if you do that, you will bear more fruit, more grain. You will reproduce. It's a law. He's made it that way. That's all we have for this Sunday school this morning. We're going to continue next week with the Sunday school on the next level. Lord bless you. We're going to get started with service in a couple of minutes.